Hi, this is Dr. Robert Guthrie again, back with you with another one of our Bible study lessons in place of the Sunday morning Sunday school at Jerome United Methodist Church. And we're going to move off of the Gospels, which we did just finished up, and then we finished Acts of the Apostles. And now we're going to start into the epistles, the letters. And there are a wide variety of letters. Most of them are by Paul. Some of them are by other people. Some of them are by unknown authors. We're going to do the Paul letters first. And I'm going to switch the order around. If you just went through the book in the order that they're presented now, you would go from Acts to Romans onto the Corinthians. I'm going to pull out what I think is probably the most pivotal letter of Paul's theology, not only for us in explaining where Christianity is now, but for Martin Luther, when he began the Protestant Reformation, it was a pivotal letter to him. And it really outlines in 6 chapters a brief but very clear movement away from what Jewish theology and teaching had been into what Christianity meant. And in this letter, he outlines it most clearly, very articulately, that things changed. The whole point of Jesus coming was not to enforce the Jewish law, which had become very detailed, burdensome. You could do this, you couldn't do that, you couldn't go this way, you couldn't do this, couldn't do that. And to replace it with salvation or justification through God's grace from faith in Jesus Christ. That's a simple message. That's what his message was. And you do find that Christianity will drift in toward being very legalistic at various times. The Catholic Church at the time of Martin Luther, you do find certain parts of Protestantism in the modern world get very legalistic. But Paul was saying you are not saved by adherence to the law. You should adhere to the law if you can, but you're not saved by that. You are saved by God's grace, which he gave to us by the sacrifice and resurrection of Jesus. So it is our faith that justifies us, not our actions as to how we do it. So it's a very interesting letter. It's very succinct. And when you get to a theological question, you go back to Galatians, and it will make it very, very clearly. Now, Paul's letters are interesting and challenging and enjoyable to study. They are not written in a comprehensive format. The only one that was written comprehensively was Romans. He had not started the church in Rome. He was planning to stop at the church in Rome on his way to Spain, which is where he's going to do his next missionary journey. And he wrote it as a letter of introduction. So it's got a relatively detailed theological discussion, and it's written several years after Galatians. So that's the only one. Most of these are written for specific situations. Galatians is written for a very specific situation. Paul's having a temper tantrum, and he's mad at Peter, or Cephas as he calls him, and some of the other Jewish Christians who came down from Jerusalem and he thought were corrupting or polluting is a better word. His churches where he had started with Gentile Christians, Christians who had not been Jewish beforehand. Other of his letters, Corinthians are a good example, are dealing with very specific issues, how the church handles the behavior of the members, their sexual behavior, their gloating of their wealth, their bickering and factions and all that. And in an interesting way, it's really not any different than the problems we face now 2,000 years later. So he doesn't have really comprehensive theology. You have to go through and try to match it to your circumstance. There are some very important points in looking at Paul's letters. Paul's letters are very different than the first 3 Gospels. The first 3 Gospels, you'll have sayings over 2 or 3 verses. You'll have stories like the Good Samaritan or the prodigal son that'll last for 14, 15, 16 verses. And you can pull them out. They can stand independently. Jesus said this, Jesus said that. And he talked about this thing and that. Paul's letters, if you pull various things out independently, you'll completely misinterpret it. And the best example, of course, is in 1 Corinthians about the spiritual gifts. And he talks about speaking in tongues. The people who are advocates of tongues speaking, which we are not in the Methodist Church, pull a couple verses out and he says, well, it would be better if we all would speak in tongues. And they quote that and they stop. But if you go on and read the rest of it, he said, but don't do it, because if everybody's doing it and some visitor comes, he's going to think you're all raving crazy, is the term. So you have to be very careful with Paul's letters that you don't select out self-serving little bits without reading the pages and pages before and after, which sets his in context. So that's an important thing about Paul's letters. And I think if you talk to Paul, which you can't do right now, and say, we studied these letters 2,000 years after you wrote them, he'd be amazed. I'm certain he had no concept that these were going to be preserved and passed down. Exactly how they were preserved is unclear. Most people think that these were so valued by the churches that they preserved them. By the end of the first century, into the second, they were being copied and distributed and passed around amongst the churches. So it gave them a chance to look back at the teachings of the great evangelizer to the Gentiles and deal with the issues that he had to, which they still had to, factionalism in the church and false teachings and behavioral issues and all that. The scholarly world has spent much time and effort trying to decide, did Paul write all the letters attributed to him? If so, how, or if not, how can you sort out which he did or didn't write? And there are several themes that have emerged. There's nobody disputes that Galatians is written by Paul. There's a very interesting ending in it. He says, now you can see I'm writing in my own hand. He appears, and if you read through it in detail, to us, has some kind of visual problem. We don't really know. We don't know how old he was. This letter is written probably 57, 58, 59 in the first century, how old Paul was at the time, but he implies that he had some kind of visual problem. And so, so that's one. Everyone assumes that's authentic, and nobody really debates Romans or the Corinthians or Thessalonians. But there are some other ones, and the scholars tend to look at several things. They look at the language, how he writes. Did he use these various words more commonly at this point than at that point? Did the writing style change? And did the language change? Did the writing style change? And is the message different? Now, the problem with any of those, I've been writing professional papers for 35 years. My writing style now is very different than it was 35 years ago, even though I've still written all these papers. Because writing styles change over time, just as your own understanding of what you believe changes over time. So looking at writing style is tough because these letters are written over a 15-year period from the late 40s up to 64, and his writing style would change, as anybody's would. When you actually look at the way the words are, which words are used for conjunctions and stuff like that, there's a problem there too, because he clearly didn't write these himself, personally sat down in Galatians and wrote it. He only wrote the last paragraph or two at the end, so he dictated these to some kind of secretary, assistant, or whatever. And you will find that there may be some changes in the actual wording between what he did and the way the scribe wrote it down. And the second variable, he may have said to one of his assistants, hey, write a letter to so-and-so, and these are the points I want you to make. This is what people do in business. They have their staff write letters. Then he would have said, well, this is okay, let's change this, let's change that, and he would have approved it. So that would put a different style in there also. And the issues change over time. But since these were written for particular issues, that's going to change. So I'm not going to, in this series, worry a whole lot about whether Paul wrote all of these letters. He very well may have, and he may not have. There may have been a couple that he didn't write, or that his followers wrote 5 or 10 years later and put his name on as a tribute. The concept of copyright and not putting anybody else's name on something that person didn't write, it's completely different in that era. Even if he had not written, let's say, Ephesians, there's some debate about that, but they put his name on it a couple years later, that was an act of homage, of respect, to put his name on that letter. So Those are the issues that come up in Paul's letters. So we'll talk about Galatians. Like I said, it's a temper tantrum. I think it's a good way to describe it. And the gist of it is that he had gone back to Jerusalem several years before to have the great council with the pillars, as he called them, Peter, James, the brother of the Lord, in which he presented to them what he was doing. This is in 57 or so, as the evangelist to the Gentiles, and that he would. They made an agreement of whether it was a compromise or an agreement or whatever. They hammered out that there were several things. Okay, they did not have to be circumcised. Circumcising adults in that era was not a popular thing. And circumcision was not as common then as it is now in the United States. There were certain ethnic and religious groups that circumcised routinely. The Jewish people did. Other groups did. And in modern life, the Muslims do and the Jewish people do. Here in the United States, it's an optional thing, belief-wise, and most of the infants are circumcised, infant males, simply for hygiene later down the life. And but it was a very important issue because you didn't have any anesthesia, you didn't have antibiotics, you didn't have any pain medications. It would be an uncomfortable and difficult procedure. So there wasn't a lot of popularity in that among the Gentiles. And so they agreed, didn't have to be circumcised, that baptism, the rite of joining the church, that being baptized replaced the need of circumcision, so as your identification. But they did want several things. They did not want the Gentile Christians to eat food sacrificed to the idols, meat sacrificed, lamb or whatever type of farm animal had been sacrificed, and the sacrifices to the pagan gods. They did not want them to consume blood. This is very much a strong law inside Judaism. And so you couldn't strangle any animal that you're going to eat because you wouldn't drain the blood. You had to butcher them in a traditional manner. And they did not want people having illicit marriages. This is an interesting and challenging one because in the Roman world, if you're familiar with Roman history, sexually the Romans would do pretty much anything. And they weren't ashamed of it. They were proud of it. If you go through Pompeii, which I have not done, and look at the art on the wall that was preserved, much of it is sexual behavior. So they didn't want illicit marriages, which would be a variety of different things, incest and things like that. And Paul agreed to that. Then he went back and started his missionary journeys again and had a bunch of his churches. Then there's a confrontation in Antioch, which is in western Syria on the coast, in which Cephas, as he calls him, Peter, would come, and he would participate easily with the Gentile Christians. He'd eat meals with them and all that, and he wouldn't insist on supervision. And then somebody else would come out from Jerusalem and say, no, you got to be circumcised, you have to meet these strict dietary laws, blah, 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 blah. And I can understand why they would say that. They've got the theology wrong. Paul's theology is correct. You're saved by God's grace, not by your deeds. But they have spent their whole lives forcing these rules on themselves and everybody else, and it's a tough thing for them to give it up. And so there was a confrontation at Antioch between Paul and Peter. I don't know who won. Each side went at each other, and basically Paul called him a hypocrite for kowtowing to these people. And this violates our agreement, blah, 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 blah. So apparently they kept doing it because Galatia is up in west central Turkey, where Turkey is now. So he's writing back to them because apparently they've done the same thing, and the Galatians are starting to drift away from this. As you read Paul's letters, you'll see they're getting factionalism and drift away from the base. It's a big problem in his churches, as it is in our churches now. There's nothing really remarkable there. So he's saying, wait a minute. That's not the point. The point is Jesus came, died for us on the cross, and was resurrected. And what saves us is our faith in him and the resurrection. And that the law as it was structured, because by this time, several thousand years in, Jewish law had become extremely intricate, very specific, what you can do and you can't do. And he said it only condemns. It makes you a slave to these rules, when the real rule is have faith in Jesus Christ as your personal Savior, and that will free you from having to obey the law. Jesus came to replace the law, not to reinforce it. So it's a very interesting and stunning thing. And as you read it, he's shouting at them, "You foolish Galatians," and stuff like that. So, like I said, it really was a temper tantrum. And the striking thing about this letter was this one in Romans, but particularly Galatians, is what got Martin Luther to realize that the legalism of the Roman Catholic Church at his time, it's all changed, of course, churches change all the time, was not scripturally sound. It was serving the power structure of the church, and he started his rebellion by writing a variety of treatises and ended up in creating the Reformation. He didn't know what was going to happen either when he started, I'm certain, because he realized that, as it said in Galatians and Romans to a certain degree, that we're saved by our faith, not by our actions. And so it's a very, very fundamental letter, the most important one. Now you get into the last two chapters, and he suddenly has to pivot, because what does this mean if you're saved by your faith? Does it mean you can go do anything? Be an adulterer, be a dishonest businessman, worship money and all that. And he says, oh, no. This is not license for self-indulgence. That's the term he uses. It's a very interesting way of phrasing it, because as you get in his other letters, he really struggles with, yes, you're saved by your faith, but how do you behave as a Christian? And so he says this does not allow you for self-indulgences, for sexual immorality, for anger, for factionalism, for greed, for drunkenness, a wide variety of things. He has to, even in this one brief 6-chapter letter, he has to pivot back to how do we behave. Now, he does have an excellent answer. The only law we really need to obey is love your neighbor as yourself. And so if you truly love your neighbor, you won't be quarrelsome. You won't be difficult. You won't be manipulative. You won't be sexually immoral. You won't be a drunkard. And so he pivots back. It's very interesting that even in his most passionate letter about salvation through faith and faith alone, he has to pivot back to explain that this does not give you license to do whatever you want to. So it's very, very interesting. And he goes through that list of, so it's how do you behave? We should be behaving in a loving and upright manner, and we should share everything and support those around us, not just our immediate family, but when you say your neighbor, includes people you don't like, people you have to work with, people you have to deal with. It's very challenging, and so it's a very difficult thing for us to do. And you do find these issues struggling along in churches now. I've never been in a church that didn't have some degree of factionalism, people bickering with, and usually if you step back from these and look at it in a logical sense, most of the fighting is of no value. And you do have churches struggle with what kind of rules about behavior to have. For a long, certain churches still have rules against card playing and dancing. These rules are not scriptural. I had a patient who was a Baptist pastor, and he explained that the dancing, I said, there's no dancing prohibition in the scriptures. And he said, no, it's tradition, because that evolved from when the Baptists emerged about 1600. What was the dance hall in 1600? Dance hall was a brothel in 1600. So the rule against dancing was keep the young men out of the brothels. That's a good rule in its own sense, but it's different now. Card playing was the same way. Gambling den was a brothel, a place of iniquity, keep the young men out of those. But that doesn't mean playing a bridge or canasta game or other things like that or all that sinful. So you have to be careful not getting hung up in our own things with the rules. We Methodists are not supposed to do alcohol or gamble. I don't do those. That's fine. But again, they're not scriptural either. So it's always a balance. So we're saved by our faith, not by our behavior. But we're supposed to behave in a positive, cheerful, loving, joyful manner that represents the faith well. So that's a very interesting. So read this letter and enjoy it. Because, and remember, even Paul had a temper. I'm certain he did. If you look back and we talked about all his traveling companions were always changing in Acts. So I think he was the greatest Christian leader of all time. He may not have been the easiest Christian leader of all time to get along with. So But it's a good temper tantrum. But it's the most important letter for outlining what our Christian faith really is: justification through faith, saved by God's grace through our faith. This is Dr. Guthrie. It's a pleasure.